Hello, everyone. Welcome to the side event on how to bridge the climate finance gap and support smallholders in food systems transformation. If I might just ask everyone to take their seats now. And those at the corners, you're welcome to come up front. We have a seating capacity of 300 people in this room. We don't expect it to be full. So if you come here, it's actually easier to have a conversation. It's going to be very much a discussion here. So I would like to welcome everyone to come up front. So it makes it easier for the people carrying the mic as well. So my name is Dinesh. I'm the founder of a new NGO called Clim-Eat. So we're a think and do tank for food and climate. And this is our first COP, really. So really grateful to be here. And we're working with the co-organizers of this session. This session is hosted by the Environmental Defense Fund, the Southern African Confederation of Agriculture Unions, the International Fertilizer Association, and the International Rice Research Institute. So they are the conveners of this session, and it has two goals, essentially, that you can see from the title. So one is about availability of finance. So how can we bring more finance to the table for food systems transformation? The second is, once the finance is on the table, how do we make it accessible, especially for smallholder farmers? So that's a twin goal here, and we have some very interesting speakers and counting on your inputs as well so that we can answer these questions. So that's a bit of scene setting from me, and the format we'll have is like we will have an opening remark from Jochen Flasbarth, the State Secretary of BMZ, the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development in Germany. And then after that, we will open up to the different panelists to share their reflections on what has been said. So I would like to welcome you, State Secretary.
Hello, everybody. Happy to be here. Side event, how to bridge the climate finance gap and support smallholders in food systems transformation. So you have a lot in it already in the title. I want to applaud my friends from EDF, also from the International Fertilizer Association and the International Rice Research Institute, as well as the Southern African Confederation of Agriculture. I mean, as I said, in this title you have all the ingredients for a very lively and maybe also heated debate. But against the background, the geopolitical background we are having right now with the Russian war against Ukraine, the global food system is highly under pressure. What we see at the moment is brighter than ever before, that we did not, and here I'm at the transformation part, that we did not start early enough to transform our food system. It is as unsustainable as you can imagine. Only the fact that some countries in the world are dependent on 80, 90, 95% on imports of food is a clear indication that something is wrong. We have to enhance the capacity of countries in the world to produce their own food. Of course, also wherever possible to have an international trade exchange. We are nothing against trade, but in principle, we have to increase their capability of producing food. So starting with here it is, starting with the climate finance gap, which is an issue its own. We know there is, regardless for what sector, we have a gap in climate finance. We have the promise from the industrialized world to deliver $100 billion annually as of 2020. We know that we failed. The North failed to deliver on this promise back from Copenhagen. Now we are around 83 billion. It's not nothing. And sometimes I was asked, I mean, looking at the huge cost for the transformation, the overall 2030 agenda, and of course also the food system. But looking at the overall costs, isn't that anyway only peanuts, this 100 billion? And my answer usually is, yes, it is, but with regard to trust in promises, it's like an ocean. If you fail to deliver what you promised, you run into a serious multilateral problem. So, having said that, Germany, we are doing, I would say, our best, and we are not the worst in class. We promise to increase our share of the 100 billion from 4 billion that was pledged for 2020, and we overachieved it to at least 6 billion in 2025. Last year, our overall public funding support amounted to 5.3 billion euros. By the way, more or less half adaptation and mitigation. And we all know we all have to do more. Also, we have to do more. Crystal clear. Now, looking more in detail, moving from the gap to the agriculture food sector. If you look at the figures from OECD, you can see that only 9% of the overall mitigation and adaptation climate finance goes to the agriculture and fisheries food sector. And that is covering everything. And it's very obvious that this is not enough. And now we didn't even answer the question, what of these 9%, which share goes to smallholder farmers, and then you immediately see that we are by far lacking behind, having in mind that the smallholder farmers, 500 million of them produce 1/3 of the global food supply. So that is really a huge gap, what we need to do and what we are doing. So scaling up is the mandate of the day, of the time. Let me add here, this is not doable by public funding alone. It's very obvious. Even if we were in a position to double, triple, quadruple our public finance, we would not provide sufficient funding for the needs we have. And that does not say by any means that we will not and should not increase our public funding, but we have to do much, much more to make available the private sector, or to bring in the private sector and make available private funding. And that obviously needs some innovative approaches. I think the private sector is ready to invest into sustainable supply chains in the food and agriculture and fisheries sector. There is an increasing awareness of the value of ecosystem services, and people are ready to pay for that. Now, how do we match that to get the readiness to pay into real financial flows towards smallholders, farmers? One of the approaches had been developed by the working group, the G7 working group on food security. at the moment under German presidency. And we have launched exactly last Friday what we call Compens Action as an innovative financial tool exactly to make this transformation from ecosystem service and bring their added value back to smallholder farmers. The policy brief was launched last Friday, but tomorrow we will have a signing ceremony between BMZ, my ministry, and IFAD, where I'm a governor, so I have to take care about them anyway. We will provide 15 million for piloting the first compensation mechanisms under the umbrella of Compens Action. Hope that is one of the examples that brings us a real step forward. And having said that, I wish this side event all the success it deserves.
Thank you, Mr. Flasbarth. That was excellent to remind us about the magnitude of the challenge that we're facing, the role of the private sector, and indeed that the public sector cannot do this on their own, and we need to bring public and private sectors together to address the challenge, and also to hear more about the Compens Action workstream as part of your G7 presidency. And I also had the chance to moderate the launch of the policy brief on Friday, and Lini, sitting next to you, is the lead author of that policy brief, so hopefully we can hear a bit more about the recommendations in the course of the panel. But the challenge has been outlined, the opportunities have been outlined, but now we need to make this happen. So that'll be the focus of the panel discussion. So I'd like to invite the panelists to join. I'll maybe introduce each one of you. So firstly, you, Alzbeta Klein, Director General of the International Fertilizer Association, and she's, yes, please. So, and the International Fertilizer Association has been focused on how to transition the fertilizer industry towards a more sustainable pathway. And in respect to the opening remarks, we can really see the role of the private sector, and you're really bringing that perspective here, Alzbeta. Thank you. Secondly, I'd like to invite Fred Krupp, the President of the Environmental Defense Fund, one of the other co-organizers of this event. And Fred has been guiding EDF for the past 3 decades and positioned EDF as one of the leading environmental organizations in the world. So we also need the NGO community in this conversation on scaling up finance, and Fred is bringing that perspective. Thirdly, a very important perspective is that of farmers. So I'd like to welcome Ishmael Sunga, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Southern African Confederation of Farmer Agriculture Unions. So he's representing farmers from 16 different Southern African countries here. So once we have the finance available, how do we get it to the level of farmers? So that's what Ishmael will talk about. And finally, my colleague, Lini Wollenberg. Lini has multiple hats. She's a research professor at the University of Vermont. She's also a senior scientist with the Alliance of Bioversity International in CIAT. But she was previously working with me on the CCAFS program of the CGIAR, and she's representing here the International Rice Research Institute and bringing insights on the work that she did as part of CCAFS and continues to do as part of the CGIAR on connecting finance to small-scale farmers. So this is the panel we have with the research perspective as well. So I want to start with you, Alzbeta. So what are the big opportunities that you see? You've heard the challenges from the public sector side. From your side, what are the opportunities you see?
Thank you very much, Dhanush. So delighted to be here with you on this panel. I'd like to just give you a little bit of a broader picture of what we need to do and what is the scale of the problem, and then address in a couple of words what private sector can do about it. So when we look at climate finance gap, we have to ask a more fundamental question, and that is, what is the farmer finance gap? Because climate finance gap is what comes afterwards. And what we observe in broader scale for subsistence farmers is just a complete lack of finance, period. So let me paint a picture of where financing needs to come and then how we get it into the climate finance. First and foremost, most of the smallholders have extremely limited access to any finance. And they are the first ones in the value chain who help feed us, as we heard from the State Secretary. But we also, when we go up the value chain, we have agro dealers, and they too have a huge gap in how they get funded, and they often get funded in less than perfect way. And then it goes to banking institutions on the continent in sub-Saharan Africa, and they often do not have funding to finance agriculture because funding for agriculture is deemed to be risky. So the first question that we have to ask ourselves is, how do we actually crowd in financing for the farmers? And then the second question comes, how do we get climate finance? How do we bridge the climate finance gap for the farmer? So with this picture, let me just paint a picture of where the financing can come in, both in what I would call regular agri-finance and then the climate finance. When it comes to subsistence farmers, we need to incentivize banks to bring in more financing for agriculture. And because banks work on their risk appetite, we need to help them de-risk, and we can do it through blended finance. So for every public dollar, public euro, public pound that come to agriculture, we can bring in several dollars, pounds, euros of private finance, blend it together, and bring in the necessary financing for agriculture. Then we need to go to agro dealers and allow them to have access to trade finance. When cost of inputs increased tremendously over the past little while, we need to make sure that trade finance multiplies accordingly. And then this particular finance needs to trickle down to the farmer who is actually growing food on the land. When it comes to climate finance, this is even bigger gap than we have in general financing. And here is where the incentives for the farmers need to come in. Farmers need to be incentivized with financing to allow them to use farming practices that are more environmentally sound. They need to use plant nutrients according to 4R at the right time, at the right place, at the right quantity, and at the right structure. And if we can incentivize farmers to bridge that gap, we're going to see very different outcomes. So to bring that in, again, we would call for blended finance, where any public dollar euro is blended with private financing and multiplies access of farmers to financing. And last but not least, to close my opening remarks, this is not about the farmer. This is about all of us, because as we heard from the initial speaker, subsistence farmers provide a lot of food to all of us. So this is not just about helping the farmer. This is helping the entire food system and the entire food system transformation, both in terms of availability and accessibility of food, and also in terms of sustainability of food. Thank you. Dhanush, back to you.
Thanks, Alzbeta, and yeah, really get the point on blending public and private financial sources, and thank you so much for highlighting that. Fred, I want to come to you next, and how do you see this? What are the key opportunities that you see in mobilizing more finance?
Well, the key opportunities have to center around the people who are doing the work, the farmers and the fishers and everybody else who works in the sector. And, you know, we know now that the best estimates tell us that food systems make up as much as 30% of emissions to the atmosphere. So keeping 1.5 alive or any other goal would require us to make sure farmers and fishers are thriving, that their livelihoods are improving based on the solutions. And so oftentimes people say, well, okay, let's put these people, let's give them a seat at the table. That's just not enough. We have to give these folks leadership roles at the table. That's why I'm so happy to see you here as a farmer, because that's what it's going to take. We need to have farmers and fishers actually helping construct solutions in a way that is shaping the investments so that the farmers and the fishers become beneficiaries and benefit from in any transition. Of course, there are going to be enormous economic opportunities, and if the people who are now working in those industries aren't at the table and playing a leadership role, then we won't have the thinking that we need to make sure those people are the beneficiaries. So in the last couple of days here, we've seen a series of really good announcements. We've seen announcements that are from governments, and we've seen announcements that are from donors to, increase investments in adaptation and resilience, in solar electrification of food systems, in scaling regenerative practices and scaling indigenous practices, and those are good. But they're not enough. There has to be a vastly increased flow of dollars, and to do that, the investment community has to be fully on board. And the investment community has to take into account that we are now living in a climate-impacted world. There are more floods, there are more droughts, there are less biodiversity, and the oceans are warming, which has tremendous effects as fish go to different countries, literally, swimming away from the equator and moving away from the equator. So anyway, at the Environmental Defense Fund, we talked to 170 financial institutions to see how are they thinking about it. And these financial institutions were in India, they were in the United States, they were in Europe, they were in Mexico, and other places. And what we found was, frankly, a little disconcerting. 87% of these financial institutions told us that yes, they recognize that the climate impacts were going to have big impacts on the food systems. Well, that's not disconcerting, that's good. So why did I say disconcerting? Because 75% of them told us that they don't really consider this in any significant way when they make their loans and investments. That's disconcerting because until they consider the impacts on their loans, for those farmers who see a need to make a transition to more resilient crops, more resilient practices, practices that may also reduce emissions, if the financing institutions aren't including this in their decisions, they won't realize that they should be shifting what they give money for, what they finance. And they won't be supporting farmers to make the transition. So that is, I would submit to you, the biggest opportunity is to, one of the big opportunities certainly is to close that disconnect, because only when those financial institutions can take the knowledge that they have that the world is changing and apply it to what they're doing with their portfolios, only then do farmers and fishers have a chance of getting the new sorts of financing that they need to make the transition.
Thank you, Fred. Actually, if I might just come back to you with a small follow-up question. You mentioned 3 points which I picked up. One was the farmer-centric approach, fisher-centric approach, producer-centric approach, really. The second was on the promises which are being made here. How do we translate into action? And the third was really about incorporating into the climate change into the financial institutions. My question is, why is it not already happening? Because I was reading your bio, and you're a champion of the environmental movement over the past 3 decades. Why is it that the promises that are being made often are not being delivered, or are they being delivered? So what is missing in your view?
That's probably a longer conversation, but I don't think it's through bad intentions. I do think change always takes time and requires incentives, to repeat the word you used, and I don't think yet we've put enough effort in really moving the whole system, including the incentives. But I don't think people are being mean-spirited. I just think change takes time.
Okay. Thanks, Fred. And we can continue the longer conversation later.
Yeah.
So, Ishmael, both Alzbeta and Fred have highlighted the role of a farmer-centric approach. And you are leading farmers in your region. What are the big opportunities that you're seeing?
Thanks, Dhanush, for the question. Let me just shed a few perspectives from what we gather on the ground from farmers, and then also our own assessment of the situation. I think the first point really is, before I forget this one, is to appreciate all the commitments, funding commitments that are coming from various sources, but also add to say that it's not enough. We need much, much more. And we need those commitments to be honored. I think in case I lose that message towards the end, but I thought I should just highlight it at the beginning. We need more and more and more, and a lot of it going to adaptation, and we need the commitments that have been made to be followed through. And there need to be a mechanism to ensure that it happens. Otherwise, it will remain no talk and no action. That's the first point. But back to I think there's a way of framing that we need to be careful about, in my view. The first thing is to be clear that the financing challenges of smallholders are beyond climate financing. They are much broader. So sometimes we latch on to one thing and forget that there's a fundamental problem about access to basic facilities, backbone infrastructure, no roads, no water, no energy, nothing. So if we slice a piece of only climate financing, yeah, it could be an interesting debate, but is it going to make the change that we want without the backbone infrastructure that is needed? So let's make sure that we don't lose the broader financing requirements and just focus on one slice. And I see that tendency, and I wish we could have more disciples to spread that message. Otherwise, climate financing is just a small part. The second part really is about this, I think the new kid on the block, so to speak, is subsidies. Yeah, subsidies has become sort of the main instrument that people want to latch onto, and yet subsidies are very small, tiny proportion of the financing infrastructure. There's much, much more. So let's also be careful not to be tunneled into a particular narrative that is actually not looking at it in a holistic form. So the main point really is, in my view, is that we need to look at all the different sources of financing. Some of it is commercial, others are philanthropic, could be development, could be public, could be a combination of both. But we need a whole basket of financing options. It's so fundamental because what is required is big and might not be possible to be provisioned from one source. But there also have to be values and principles around that. I don't think it's fair and proper, morally or otherwise, to expect a financial instrument from a bank to finance subsistence adaptation. It's not possible for them to pay it back. In any case, why should companies profiteer from a misfortune by smallholder farmers that they are not responsible for? So when you talk about blended financing and about de-risking of financing that is going to the smallholder sector, to me it does not make sense. I think there are other instruments that are there. When we talk about mitigation financing, perhaps it makes sense, but we cannot expect loan financing. In any case, they won't be able to pay for it. Apart from the fact that it is not fair for whoever, companies or otherwise, to profiteer from a misfortune that smallholder farmers are addressing, and yet they were not the cause of it. So we need to really look at that. Maybe the final point at this point is that financing alone is not enough. There have to be complementary requirements that makes financing much more productive. It could be financing that has to be accompanied by financing of advisory services. It could be financing that is accompanied by the organization of farmers into viable enterprises. It could also be financing, and this is important for us, that is looking at the development of a new generation of climate-sensitive farmers. And we have seen it happen. It's already happening on the ground. Maybe what is required is a mapping of what actually are these new generation of agripreneurs doing, and how can we quantify and map that, and how can we begin to profile the investment opportunities, mitigation or otherwise, that are emerging, and how do we then look at perhaps assisting in the pre-feasibility investment assessments and supporting due preparations and follow through. Let's be a bit more imaginative in selling the opportunities, particularly to the new generation of farmers that are emerging from mitigation and adaptation. And funny enough, when they are doing it, they don't think in terms of adaptation and mitigation. They just do it. We might decide to call it the way that we want, but all the same, I think we really need to be a bit more creative in designing the solutions. Otherwise, we are selling problems and not selling opportunities. I stop here for now. Thank you.
Well said.
Quick follow-up, Ishmael. Quick follow-up. So you mentioned this new generation of agripreneurs you'd like to see. Just to make it quite specific, what would they look like? Like, what's your vision? Like, and where would they get financing from? You also mentioned the smart income streams. So who will this person or persons be, and where will they get financing from?
I'll just give a practical example. I'm not imagining, I'm talking about what I've seen happening on the ground. And my popular example is one of a young poultry farmer from Zimbabwe who is using maggots as his feed, poultry feed. And he's doing it not in the name of mitigation or adaptation or anything. He just found it fascinating and is making money out of it. And we believe there are a lot of examples around that. The question that for me it raises is, how many such happenings are already there? And we need to map them. And another question that is important for us, and really that I would also want to crowd in assistance from, is I want to check out what is the potential value of maggots in Southern Africa. Does it go into trillions or not? If it does, how do we begin to look at investment profiles, pre-feasibility checkouts, and how do we then begin to really invite both philanthropic capital, development capital, commercial capital, you name it, and just walk the journey. Sometimes we're imagining things that are already happening, and we have not taken time consciously enough to actually go in and check it out. So that would be a practical example of how I think we could actually move forward on this.
Thank you, Ishmael. Lini, coming to you, you've heard the perspectives from the others, and from your perspective, and you've also led the policy brief on compensation. And what are the big opportunities you see, both financial and in terms of innovation as well?
Thank you, Dhanush. First, I want to comment on a few exciting opportunities that are happening at scale, which are the nationally appropriate mitigation actions that several countries have prepared in livestock and rice, where we know that we could have national scale implementation. For example, Colombia has a livestock NAMA, Kenya has a dairy NAMA, Vietnam is about to prepare a rice NAMA, and in the case of Vietnam, we know that they're estimating they could reduce 2 to up to 7 million tons of CO2 equivalents per year, and they're ready for finance. The rice emissions would be, the emissions from the rice would be reduced, we'd be reducing water use, we'd be improving soil health, so we'd have multiple ecosystem services that this would be providing. So that's on the NAMA side, that's a ready plan that just needs finance. But then referring to the compensation work, which is very exciting as an initiative of the G7 presidency and the German government, we surveyed a number of different existing arrangements for payments of ecosystem services, and we looked in depth at 14. And I think what's interesting is that we're seeing really different kinds of innovation related to reinvesting in farmers. So for example, a pro-soil project in Kenya is using credits from improved soil health to support technical advisory services to farmers. A project in, this is actually not a project, a policy in Colombia is asking companies to fulfill their tax obligations by supporting conservation projects. They can actually allocate funding. Instead of paying their taxes, they contribute to conservation. The Rimba project in Indonesia is using supply chain actors, in this case oil palm producers and processors, to pay a fee back also into a conservation fund. So really diverse kinds of payment schemes. And the last point that I want to make is that we're also seeing at scale these payments for ecosystem service programs happening. For example, through the Livelihoods Fund, we have 21 different companies who've banded together to create a fund to support these kinds of projects. Thank you.
Thanks, Lini. I actually want to go back to you, Alzbeta. So we've heard the different innovations. We've heard the point which you started about blending different sources of finance, the farmer-centric approach, and so on. But from your view, what would success look like? You know, if we are actually successful in deploying multiple sources of finance, blending private and public capital, what would it look for the fertilizer industry? What would it look like for farmers, in your view?
Right. Thank you, Dhanush. So before I answer your question, what success looks like, I have to tell you that this panel makes me a little bit worried. And what makes me worried is what Fred said, which is 75% of financial institutions are not taking into account climate risk. Where we sit today, there is already very limited funding going into agriculture because it's considered to be risky. If and when banks are starting to consider climate risk, which is substantial and we know it, what I worry about, that there'll be even less funding going to mainstream agriculture. And I'm not talking climate finance, I'm just talking straightforward financing to ag. So this is not good or bad, this is just scary, because I think we are missing a lot of funds for agriculture. And I think Ishmael said it very well as well. We need to consider all sources of funding, not just climate finance. So this is actually food for thought and a bit of a pause in terms of how do we crowd in public and private financing to farmers, period, and then how do we actually optimize it for climate. So what does success look like? Dhanush, I'd like to just come back to your question, what does it look like for fertilizer industry? I want to change that question. It is not about what it looks like for fertilizer industry. It is what it looks like for our global food system. The industry that I represent is actually a broad ecosystem of players. We represent obviously producers of mineral fertilizers, but we also represent biologicals and all the agtech that comes our way, and universities and research institutes. So this is about what the food system is going to be looking like when we get it right. So a couple of thoughts on that. First and foremost, we are sitting here today facing global food crisis. And I know that it may be not as visible to those of us who are delegates here, and yesterday I spent some time with my former colleagues from the World Bank Group, and perhaps on the other side of the Atlantic it doesn't look as visible, but living in Europe, it is extremely visible and it's extremely present. At the moment, we are missing grains and oilseeds from Ukraine and other regions. We are missing fertilizers that are going to produce those grains and oilseeds 6 months from now. And it is pretty serious. We are seeing gaps in plant nutrients for farmers in Africa as we speak. So I think we have to start with where we are today. Kind of how do we feed the world? And so the first and primary objective is that we have enough to feed the world, and then we reverse the trend of people being food insecure, which unfortunately in the past 12 to 18 months happened very rapidly. So that's the first part of the success. The second part of the success is that we've got farmers who understand their soil and are using best available technologies depending on their region, depending on their part of land that they are tending, and they use the best available technologies to produce that food sustainably. And the third part is availability of financing for them to be able to do so, both to be able to plant what they need to plant for themselves, potentially even plant for the market, and making sure that they do so in a way that is climate positive. So whether it's regenerative agriculture, whether it's keeping carbon in soil, whether it's getting carbon credits, that is what success would look like. So again, just to sum it up, first, making sure that we reverse the food insecurity trend. making sure that we bring everyone to the table on finance and making sure that the farmers understand what it takes to do it sustainably.
Thanks, Alzbeta. I want to ask you a follow-up question. I think it's important you brought the dimension of conflict and the trend around food insecurity as well. But what is a solution that you see, and solution in terms of financial mechanisms in the next year or so?
We're sitting here in a very, very difficult geopolitical situation, and the reality of the world is that we are missing substantial parts of grains that used to be coming out of Ukraine. There is a bit of a trickle coming out, but not enough. We are missing oil seeds. Those of you who live in Europe, you probably see on the shelves of grocery stores. We have just replaced sunflower oil with palm oil because we don't have sunflowers. Well, guess where they come from? They come from Ukraine. So we have to solve the existing flow of grains, and there is UN initiative that is addressing that, more or less, and we have to see if in the next couple of days this initiative continues. That's first part of the solution. The second part of the solution is precursor to those grains and oil seeds and food, which is mineral fertilizers. And again, the reality there on the ground is that we've got about 25% of traded fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer, being produced in Russia. And between Russia and Belarus, about 40% of potash is missing in the market. So we need to find a solution for that. And we need to find it in the environment where farmers need to do it sustainably. However, I do believe that sustainability and availability here go in the same direction, because when something is less available, you make sure that you're going to use it in the right quantity and no more, in the right quality and no less. And so I think these two trends actually go together. So the second part of the solution is finding trade arrangements so that fertilizers get to the poorest farmers, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. And the third part is making sure that our global trade system works, because we can produce enough food for the world, but we have to make sure that it gets to places where it needs to go. So WTO and other UN institutions to ensure that we continue to trade in grains and oilseeds, and we bring them to the parts of the world where they are needed today.
Thanks, Alzbeta. Fred, I want to come to you now, and Alzbeta has set out what success looks like from her perspective, short and longer term. What does it look like from your perspective, success?
Well, what does it look like? Not so much from my perspective, but from my perspective, it's got to be success from the smallholders' perspective. And when we talk to the smallholders, whether they're farmers or fishers, what they tell us, what they need most, is that the resources, whether it's the fishery or their land, they need more control over it, more ownership of it, and that only then, can they thrive. So when I think about finance and the relationship with finance to that, is that finance has to create the conditions that give smallholders more tenure rights, because everywhere in the world, this is the message that folks talk to us. So that was one thing that success likely looks like, is more ownership and control in one fashion or another. It's different in different places of the world, I understand. A second thing that success looks like is where the financial institutions learn what the worldview of the farmers and fishers are. And only if you're informed by the local geographies and the local conditions do you have a prayer of creating solutions and mechanisms that will answer those needs. Now, this isn't just to be good people that we need to care about smallholders. This is because it's essential from any way you look at it. If you look just from the climate lens, just at one problem, methane, we have huge agri-dairies and we have smallholders. The smallholders are responsible for producing 80% of the methane. methane is causing more than a third of the global warming, and human-caused methane emitted this year will do more to warm the planet in the next 10 years than all the burning of all the fossil fuels and all the CO2. So methane is big, and agriculture is the biggest part of it. So we have to create things that work for farmers. We can't just tell them, do this. We have to create ways and structures that make it in their interests, and carbon credits is referred to maybe one of those things. But I think there's four other quick things. One is what is just that we have to create these income generating opportunities. That's what will make it work, and that's what will help the most vulnerable, who are at the foundation of any of our food systems. Two, measurement protocols. These are important for things like carbon credits, but they have to work for smallholders. If they're onerous, if they're too expensive, if they don't work, if they're too burdensome, it just doesn't work. So designing those systems that do work is my second point. Third thing is oftentimes there's a curve where to make a transition, you're going to have either less fish or you're going to have in the short run less crop yield. And so we've got to provide the financing that gets smallholders through that period of transition. My last point is, there's got to be more thought to the long-term investments that ensure stability, resilience, and future prosperity. Much more thought into that than has so far been given.
Thanks, Fred. I have a follow-up question again. Maybe less on the content, but maybe another perspective, because in both your remarks you stressed on the role of fishers, and I think that's often a conversation that gets neglected in these fora. We are only looking at land-based farming system often, and it's great you brought that perspective, and together we are hosting the Food Systems Pavilion, where we will be discussing issues around fishers and aquaculture today. But what would success look like for them is my question, because I can understand the opportunity around methane for rice farmers, for example. But what would it look for the fishers and aquaculture farmers?
Well, we've had a tragedy of collapsing fishing stocks around the world for way too long, but now we have, thankfully, these examples of coastal areas which are changing the way they manage fishers. And what it looks like is they're giving fishers more control over the resource, because when you don't do that, everyone who fishes is trying to catch fish as fast as they can, because if they don't, somebody else will. But once you give them a stake in that fishery, an ownership stake in the future of that fishery, suddenly it's in the interest of all the fishers to cooperate and not fish on the pregnant mother fish that may have thousands, tens of thousands of eggs in one mother, not fish in the critical spawning areas, even to create marine protected areas, which typically in my country, the United States, and around the world, fishermen have often seen MPAs as, oh, that's bad for fishing, they're off limits. But when they get a measure of control or even ownership in their fishery, they see an MPA as, let's protect that spawning area, because the spillover fish will make us we can have way more fish. And so now we see many places in the world, including the United States, but Belize and Japan just had a major transformation of their fishery thanks to the legislation of the DIAT, which are creating much more resilient, a lot more fish in the ocean. That's just a lot better for fishers and for the ecosystem, and by the way, for the climate, because we've learned that these fish store a tremendous amount of carbon.
Thank you so much, Fred. Ishmael, moving to you. I mean, we've heard two different perspectives on what success will look like. from your perspective, what would success look like?
There are a couple of the operational things, more practical things that success could look like when we have more and more and more resources from different sources, a basket of funding solutions that speaks to the diversity of different farming systems. So more and more commitments being honored and more funds available to cater for the difference. So from a practical side, I think that's important as success. And we need to have it as quickly as possible, not in the far distant future, but in the near distant future. So that's the first point. The second point really is that we need to be, it has to be transformational. If it's going to give us a nature positive farming system that still delivers poverty on one hand and opulence on the other, it's not going to work. So if we don't enshrine values and principles of equity and fairness in the distribution of risk and reward, we are going to be replicating the same thing that ultimately is not going to be sustainable anyway. So we cannot, because there's no guarantee that the value chains that are going to emerge in their nature positive format are not going to continue to impoverish the primary producers. So if we don't build mechanisms right from the beginning in that design, we are going to be headed for a disaster. So in my view, success would look like avoiding that we do the same thing, but now it's green, but it still delivers the same outcome anyway for farmers in terms of their livelihood. The final point, perhaps, is that we really need a system that is, everyone is going to be benefiting. The entire value chain and society at large are going. So why should it be the farmer who pays for that when everyone else is for everyone? It's a common good. And why are we talking about the farmer having to pay when everyone is going to benefit from it? So there must be ways and innovative ways of crowding in everyone to pay. Because it's a common good, it's a common public good. So this narrative, in my view, is not being championed by farmers, it's being championed by other people. And that's the reason why some of us are here to try and give a different twist, perhaps, to the conversations so that we integrate some of the values and principles that should guide us into the future. And then the final point really is, if it does not talk about the future and does not integrate a new generation of players, then it is not going to work. So let's find a latching point. To me, that would be very successful to try and drive a new generation of players in the entire agri-value chains. Thanks, over.
Thanks, Ishmael. Lini, coming to you, I'm interested to hear from your perspective what success looks like, but also what Fred mentioned about the opportunities around methane reduction in agriculture specifically. I'd be also curious to hear your perspective on that, because I know you've worked on that topic, and why we can't get there. I mean, what are the lock-ins within the system?
Thank you, Dhanush. So I want to echo something that Alzbeta said, that smallholder farming is not just about smallholder farms, it's about all of us. And I think for me, success would be when we value what smallholder farmers do as stewards of the land and the importance of smallholder farmers in our society. And that means we have to fairly price food, we have to fairly price ecosystem services. I was actually at a meeting that Alzbeta organized a week or so ago in Washington, and a McKinsey report reported that our food system is worth about $1 trillion a year, but the costs associated with that, thinking about all of the externalities, are about $2 trillion per year, with the conclusion being that agriculture is ultimately an exploitative activity of the environment. And if we add in some of these maybe social costs as well, even more so. So the question is, how can we create the systemic aspects of our society that will improve the valuation of smallholders and the ecosystem services that they provide? So I have some ideas. First, smallholders will never be, unfortunately, competitive with larger farmers just because of economies of scale and often location. And so we have to specifically target and value smallholders. And one way we can do that is when we consider sustainability finance, which I think is increasingly being mainstreamed. Just as banks review a loan in terms of collateral, and now increasingly for different sustainability aspects, they can review as well for how is this funding supporting smallholder farmers or supporting at least equity and social justice. That's one. Second is business licensing. So if a company such as an oil palm company or a coffee company is operating, before that license is granted, part of the condition of the license could be how are you supporting social equity, whether that is in exchange for tax payments or an incentive of some sort. It could be built into the business licensing scheme. The third is perhaps more difficult, but I think really, really important, which is having a bottom-up strategy as well. So smallholder farmers who are organized in cooperatives are often, they have much more negotiation power. And so I think being able to aggregate smallholders, especially in the value chain through either mills or slaughterhouses in the case of livestock, would enable more negotiation power. So that's on the question of valuation of smallholders. And again, just to stress that recognizing smallholders' value as stewards of the land is ultimately a need that society has to shift to. On the question of methane and what success would look like, I think that livestock is probably the most difficult area for mitigation because it's difficult to improve productivity at the same time that we reduce emissions. The easiest way to reduce emissions, absolute emissions in the livestock sector, is to reduce the herd. But we know that some of the most vulnerable populations in the world depend on livestock for resilience. And so, there are gradations and also diverse strategies depending on the role that livestock play. For the poorest farmers, my own position is that the best thing we could do is improve resilience and improve feed, right? Improve productivity. For the farmers where we have more intensive livestock farming, we have more options, and I think eventually what we really need is the system change there is going to be improved low emissions livestock breeds. This is actually happening in a number of countries where we're testing how to improve the breed, and this will not require management of the livestock. This will just require an improved breed. And the other options are vaccines that would alter the rumen microflora, and then also feed additives. And the question is how to make feed additives available to the many grazers in the world, which are 98% of the system. Right now, we only have feed additives available for what's called total mean ration systems, which are very intensive feeding systems. So success in that case would be, I would say, in the next 10 years, that we have new breeds, that we have low-cost feed additives, and that we have vaccine programs where not only the health of the animal is being improved, but the rumen microbiology is also affected to reduce less methane. Thank you.
And how will we get that financed? I'll come to you. Just 1 second. That was interesting. The answer is really good, like the 3 points. But coming back to the topic here is about how do we finance that?
Yeah, so we have a global methane initiative presently, and I think it's trying to marry public and private finance. And for example, on the breeding program, we have public finance mostly, but we also have many companies. We have Friesland Campina, for example, working with Wageningen University to support the breeding program. And then the question would be, how can you expand that in other regions of the world? It is largely a public sector agenda to do the breeding. Feed additives will be largely a private sector agenda, but the question is how to get that to be cost affordable, and that's going to be, again, a public sector agenda. So I don't think we can escape a public sector role, and some of this ultimately will be borne by the public sector as much as the private sector is the means for scaling. Yeah.
Thanks, Lini. Alzbeta?
Just a quick comment on methane in support of what we just heard from Lini. So the reality of the world is that when countries become richer, they actually increase their consumption of animal protein. As many of you know, I spent many years at the World Bank Group, IFC, before my current position. And as we were investing in agribusiness companies around the world at the IFC, we have seen a profound increase in desire to eat animal protein as countries get richer, as countries form middle class. And so there is another piece to the methane equation, which is education about diets and shifts of diets, because this is something that would come even before we start thinking about feed additives, which is obviously one of the solutions. But I think we need to have that conversation about what a diet should look like and how we can actually optimize what this earth can produce for all of us. I have seen the same discussion when my industry earlier this year produced a Scope 3 study. Scope 3 for fertilizers is agriculture. And among other things, we touch upon the changes in diets and what should be planted and what should be planted more and what should be planted less. So I think this is something that we need to bring into the consideration because farmers will produce what is desired by those who are buying the crops. And diet plays such a huge role in how we take it forward. Thanks, Dhanush.
I would just say, Alzbeta, that yes, and we don't have time to wait to do that first and then the other things. We've got to do all of these things simultaneously.
Yep. Good point, Fred. So I'll come back to all of you, but I want to base that on comments and questions from the audience. So I'd like to open up. There's one hand, two hand. More hands. We'll take a bunch of questions. Three hands over here. Two more. So we'll do that as a first round. So this lady in the front, gentleman back, gentleman, then yes, gentleman over there, gentleman over there. Yep.
Good day, my name is Irina Mironova. I am from Ukraine, and just my first comment. If we want food security, we have to stop war and we have to stop aggression. That's the first thing we need to know. But I work in the waste management sector, and 18% of methane are coming from the landfills. That's where consumption occurs, and that's where the food remains goes. I haven't heard anything about composting and promoting natural fertilizers. My question is probably for Elizabeth. Have you considered promoting around the world, especially in developing countries who are still relying on the landfills, the composting, separate collection of organic waste with composting and turning it into fertilizers and then bringing it back to the soils, because science is there. Compost actually increase efficiency of synthetic fertilizers, especially nitrogen containing. So thank you.
Next question, please. Let's get a few questions and then we'll come to the panel. Yes.
Good afternoon. I think my question will go to Ishmael. Ishmael, can you advise me, the unions, what is your take around organic farming? Because I hear about vaccination for animals, I hear about fertilizers, and I'm not sure what form of fertilizers are we talking about.
Okay.
And I'm more concerned when the developed countries speak about Ukraine and Russian war and food insecurity. Developing nations have been struggling, even before the Ukraine. For me, it says we are trying to be relevant to the discussions around food security.
Thank you.
So maybe we can have a conversation around, is this the only time where the developed countries observe or are aware of food insecurity? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jennifer, I think there's one more question at the back, just behind.
Thank you, Stephen Lang. Thank you to the panel. Not sure who the question is for. I just wanted to knit a couple of things together. Fred, you'd said something on risk. You'd said something on ownership and control being critical. Lini, you had spoken about bottom-up approaches. And on this question of risk, whilst traditional mechanisms are not factoring in risk of lending, I think there's this misperception that direct investing in a bottom-up way through local producer organizations is somehow more risky. I think we need to challenge that myth. If you look at the work of the World Bank on the dedicated grant mechanism, some of the work of the Forest and Farm Facility, what they're finding is that there are actually higher repayment rates, that it's a more reliable way of lending. And I wonder whether what we're failing to see in financing is that the real mitigation of risk is the social and relationship and human capital that exists in local communities that ensures that that money is well spent, well deployed, drives action more quickly, and assures repayment. So the other side of risk here is we're not factoring in the benefits of that side of a whole different field of lending. I feel needs to be created and formed.
Thank you.
And I'd be interested in your views. Thanks.
Thanks for that question. Should we just get a couple from the other side as well? I think there was a gentleman at the back. He was first, so let's go to him. And there's one front, and I'll come to you. Let's go in that order. I'm not sure how many questions we can take. So there's a gentleman at the back in the white shirt. He's had his hand up since the beginning. So.
Thank you very much. My name is Yemi Akimbamijo, Executive Director of FARA. This is a very interesting discussion, and I am an animal scientist, a ruminant nutritionist, and I'm very interested in learning a little bit more. How long is going to be too long? About 30 years ago, dairy animals in Europe would produce 30 kilograms of milk a day. And at that time, I was a student, I thought that was the ultimate. But today, dairy animals have they've surpassed that limit. They are approaching 50, 60 kilograms of milk a day. And I am asking myself, we're tasking the animals to keep producing, and we know how much grass needs to go into 1 liter of milk. But we're also saying that these animals are emitting methane. So we can't spank the baby on one side and ask the baby not to cry. So where is this metabolic balance? This is a question that demands science, and I just would like to take your perspective on this. We cannot continue to push these animals to the limit and expect equity, expect environmental sanity. It cannot work.
Yep. Yemi, this in front, the gentleman, the yellow t-shirt,
Hi, good morning. Thank you for the panel. I'm Victor from Brazil. I reinforce the point of food waste and compost from Irina in Ukraine too. But I would like to add a question about, you said credits for soil health, something like that. I would like to understand more to how does it work, how the farmers are paid, because I believe that, especially as Irina said about composting soils, a key way to tackle emissions in agricultural sector is to regenerate soils and recover the carbon content of our soils.
Okay. Yeah, this one more question here, and we finish the first round. I will come to you. We have 20 minutes, so I hope we can be quick and come back to you and another round.
Hi, I'm Pablo from iPest Food. My question is more about how we're supporting smallholders when we're accounting for the broader agricultural system that they exist within. So I'm interested, for instance, the way that we seem to be talking about it is kind of treating them in isolation. And I'm wondering how we know, for instance, that $450 billion a year gets spent on agricultural support, and the vast majority of that goes to industrial farms. 85% roughly of that goes towards agricultural effects that are degrading their surrounding environments and the environment in general. We know that 70% of land use roughly goes to meat and dairy and its feed. We know that the vast majority of that is coming from industrial farms, and it's going to societies that already have high levels of protein intake and do not need them, do not need more for nutrition. So it seems like there's a huge pool of money being sent into different areas of the agricultural system. And I was wondering how our panelists would respond to repurposing the vast amount of money that is there and actually warping our food systems against our environment, against our climate goals.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to distribute the questions among the panelists, and we'll come back for more. So, Alzbeta, the question about composting and organic fertilizers, and maybe also the point about repurposing. I'll just give everybody the questions and then open the floor. Fred, that question about risk and social capital and how those dimensions can be addressed. It'll be great if you can pick up, and maybe this point could also be of interest to you around repurposing. Ishmael, about the question about organic farming, how we approach that, and also the challenges faced by developing countries, and irrespective of the crisis, and what are the key solutions there for you. Lini, picking up on Yemi's question about the livestock sector, and also the question about soil health and credits for the soil health, so that'll be great. So now, Alzbeta, over to you.
Thank you for a great dispatch, Dhanush, much appreciated. So, to your point about Ukraine, I cannot agree with you more. The war needs to stop. That's the first point I want to say. When it comes to what are we going to use as plant nutrients, the answer is not or, the answer is and. We need to use every possible plant nutrient that we have, and that goes to organic fertilizer, mineral fertilizer, composting, and everything else. The reality of the world is twofold. One, that every type of plant nutrient contains different percentages of nutrients, and so we need to find that balance that actually works for the farmer. But we do not have a luxury to be picky. We have to use them all. The second point that we need to take into consideration is that when we are thinking about organic fertilizers, first of all, they have a little bit less nutrients, or a lot less nutrients than chemical fertilizers. But also, if we were to use just organic, we would have a constraint on biodiversity and land conversion. So we have to be careful what we're asking for, and we have to almost solve a simultaneous equation at the same time. We have to make sure that whatever emissions are coming from mineral fertilizers are contained as much as possible, but we also need to make sure that we don't reach into additional land conversion into livestock, which then produces organic fertilizer. So we need to really use them all the way we have them, use them smartly and wisely, depending on what the farmer needs, but we don't have a luxury of choice. We have to use them all, and we as an association of producers, we welcome them all. Thank you.
Thanks, Alzbeta. Fred? It's muted.
Could you sharpen the question on risk? I'm not sure I heard the question exactly.
Okay, I think as I understood, there are two dimensions around it. One is around investing in social capital on the ground, and how that plays a role in terms of managing risk and implementation as well. And the second dimension was because you talked about financial risk and the survey that you had done at the global level, looking at financial institutions and how they approach climatic risks and how they're not approaching. I think it was to probe further on that, and what forms of risk that constitute, and whether social risks are also constituted in there. Did I get that right? Okay. Is that okay, Fred?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have more to say about that. I guess what I was trying to say earlier is that to the extent that the banks are not considering these forms of risk, I understand the point that was made that maybe they're going to invest less in agriculture. That is not my intent at all. But the intent is the more they consider risk, the more likely is they will help the conversion. I had a couple of other points, if I might.
Sure, please.
On methane, not to preempt Lini, but I understand the idea of pushing cows beyond the limits of what is feasible, ethical, and all of that. But the methane problem now is largely a problem of low productivity animals. And by raising the productivity, as Lini, I think you said, by improving the quality of the food, you're actually going to vastly lower the amount of methane per kilogram of milk. So that's part of the solution, and that doesn't mean going from 30 to 60. In many cases, that means going from 1 or 2 kilograms a day to 4 or 5. So you're not getting anywhere near to these limits. And then the last point I would make on the composting issue is I see zero downside to getting at least every major city to have these green bag collection systems, and only upside for reducing methane, creating more fertilizer and more, better soil health. So I think the problem there is scaling it up and figuring out what the incentives are. But in terms of a scientific downside, maybe we need to talk more, but I'm aware of none.
Okay, thank you, Fred. Ishmael.
Just answer the gentleman about our take on organic farming. We believe in complementary systems working together, depending on the circumstances of the different type of farming systems, areas, and all that. So we think organic farming certainly has a major role to play, in as much as we think that conventional farming can also do much better in terms of reducing emissions and also in increasing our productivity at the same time. So we are not either or, we are and. And I think that's the way that we should look at things. Otherwise, we are always going to be fighting about this and over the other, because circumstances differ. So it has to be horses for courses, so to speak, in my view. And with respect to war, I think war should stop everywhere, wherever it occurs. And we cannot be talking about war stopping on one part and allow it to go on other parts. So we have to have a comprehensive, when we are condemning wars, let's condemn them in their entirety rather than selectively, because they're also causing disruptions, not in Ukraine and Russia, wherever they're happening. And they're also damaging the smallholder farmers there and disturbing their local economies and national economies. So let's have a wider way of looking at these disruptions that things happen. But I just want also Dhanush to comment on the issue that is raised. I understood the gentleman talking about that de-risking, you could use society to de-risk. That was your message, was it? Yeah. That why don't you use society to de-risk? Yes, it's one of the options that you can use that collective approach. It works for certain types of farming systems, but not also for others. But it has to be part of the mix. And I quite buy your idea, by the way, that we need to do that. It actually works. It's being used to a large extent. So, but it's not talked about as one of the mainstream options that could be on the table. The final point really is about carbon. It's about soil carbon. I mean, my main point is that the carbon market itself is a value chain. And value chains are notorious, if I might use that word, for delivering badly on one side and what. As long as we don't fix the distribution of power balance, the relations and balances, it will still give us, carbon or otherwise, it will give us disaster. So let's make sure that when we are dealing with it, already ingrain issues of equity and fairness and value in the process. Thank you.
Thanks, Ishmael. Lini?
Yeah, thank you, Yemi, for the question about metabolic balance. I would agree that sustainable intensification is the current paradigm and that there's a potential for limiting or a potential for seeing that as a maximization problem. And what we really need to be doing is thinking about a multi-objective breeding approach or multi-objective management approach where we have not just improving sustainable intensification of livestock, but we're thinking about animal health and welfare, and we're thinking about mitigation, we're thinking about resilience to drought, resilience to heat stress, and so on. So multi-objective breeding. Also, we do have multiple kinds of production systems, and ultimately we've got to design the type of intensification or the type of improvement in management appropriate to that system. And for some, that will mean more maximization of productions, and for some, it will mean more of this broad objective, multi-objective approach. For Victor from Brazil on the soil credits, so this is a project happening in Kenya through GIZ on behalf of BMZ, together with Unique Forestry and Land Use. If you come up later, I can give you some context. They are measuring the soil carbon, and then the funding is being provided. So they are then certifying via VCS or VERA, and then the funding is being paid to a technical advisory service. So not directly to farmers, but the technical advisory service, because the carbon prices are still very low. So it allows you to aggregate to have some kind of meaningful critical mass of funding, and that then becomes, I think, really an asset for farmers because it reinvests in farmers' practices. And I wanted to pick up very quickly, if I may, on the point about social capital, which is, there are impact investors out there looking for projects. And I think they just don't know, especially where these social capital systems are strong, and making the case or the business case as to repayment, would be an incentive. So identifying those communities or systems or locations and bringing that information to impact investors would be really important. Thank you.
Thanks, Lini. So I just maybe one point from me. There were two questions about fragility in the war. So I see the next session, actually, the organizers are waiting there, is hosted by GIZ, Wageningen University and FARA, and it focuses on fragility and food security. So you may also want to join that discussion and hear more. Jennifer, there was a lady over here who's had a question. There. We're running out of time, so a quick question, a quick answer.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Praveena. I'm the Chief Technology Officer of the Safe Soil Movement. And my question is to Alzbeta and Lini. I think it's in line with Victor's question. Like the carbon credit market space is pretty much there. But farmers, like you're talking about one particular project in Kenya, we have kind of ran through the VERA system of audits and whatnot. But what we have found is that like not a single project that is farmer-driven, not forestry, farmer-driven annual crop projects, which have actually been able to leverage the carbon credit market. Do you guys think there needs to be a completely different approach to, making this market accessible? Because I'm seeing that climate finance gap, the heading of this particular session, looks like we are handing out things for farmers. But like Lini said, they are going to be, they're stewards of largest chunk of land in the entire world. So one is, exists a mechanism to pay people to sequester carbon, make it accessible for farmers. That's one. Second is, there are so many, I'm seeing so many papers that have been circulated about sustainability accounting. They don't seem to be come to a point where these accounting practices can be made easily accessible to farmers. So, thank you.
Quick answer, Alzbeta.
It's a great point, and the problem is that current carbon market is extremely complex. It's still voluntary, and we need to make a few breakthroughs in a carbon market. So I would like to acknowledge the reality. It is extremely difficult for farmers to directly access carbon markets at the moment, mainly because of the imperfections in current carbon market structures. And so one way that I've seen it done, both in developing countries that Lini described and also in some of the developed markets, is through aggregators. So some of the companies that I work with have programs for farmers where they help them aggregate, they help them verify, so they do all the paperwork, and they do also monitoring and evaluation, which is quite difficult for every single farmer. But problem acknowledged, and a lot of work needs to be done, not necessarily by the farmers, but by the system of how we do carbon credits, and also by soil scientists to make sure that whatever we count as carbon credit in soil is actually real credit and that it stays in the soil, which is another topic which we can spend a lot of time on, just not today. Thanks.
Thanks, Alzbeta. So we have to close in 6 minutes. So I want to give every one of you an opportunity to close. But it has to be very short. So I have a small challenge for you. This is my colleague Lian. She's making a tweet with the photo of the panel. So you have to give one takeaway word that you want her to tweet from your perspective. And you can add a sentence to describe what you mean by it, but that may not go on the tweet. And just a small guidance from me is like, what I'm hearing is like the whole complexity of the challenge. So actually, I won't go out of here feeling empowered. I will feel out quite confused, actually, what to focus on, how to address the trade-offs, the challenges that are being faced. It's so complex, and it is. but we want to also empower action. We want to really do that bridging piece. So if you can give like your one sentence and word with a call to action type, that'll be really great. Alzbeta.
I can start. My one sentence would be de-risk agri-finance.
Perfect. Perfect. Fred, sorry. Tom's here. I'm getting confused.
Yeah, we're here.
You want him to know? No, Fred.
The food systems will become more resilient and emit less greenhouse gases when they work in a way that helps smallholders thrive.
So the word will be resilient. The word you'd like to be tweeted. Yeah, the one word. I mean, the sentence, I think it's a good summary, but she can only have one word.
Smallholders.
Perfect. Ishmael?
Entrepreneurial opportunities.
Sorry?
Entrepreneurial opportunities. The two words.
2 words.
You can make it one. Just make
Is
it
it
one
okay?
long one.
Okay.
Is that okay?
She says it's okay. Lini?
Value smallholder farming.
Yep. Thank you, Lini. So, yeah, so for me, what would empower me is like we had this massive task at the beginning, you know, how are we bridging the gap in actual finance that's on the table, and how are we actually going to bridge smallholders and fishers to that finance once it's made available. And just listening to your closing comments, and you know, how are we going to attribute value to what farmers or fishers are doing? I think that'll be the first step to do that. And then based on that value, create those entrepreneurial opportunities, which Ishmael has described. And then based on those entrepreneurial opportunities, really create an ecosystem of smallholders. And Fred made this point very clear that it really needs to be around the smallholders, the small fishers, and those communities. And building that at the global level, really realigning and de-risking the existing financial system to get this done. Thanks for those great insights. Thanks for your contributions. And I would like to thank the audience for patiently listening and contributing. You can still talk to the speakers after the event, and the people who've been working behind the scenes to actually get this event delivered. So from EDF, we have Tom Grasso over here and Jennifer, who's been running around with the microphone and doing the run of show and everything. Thanks, Jennifer. Martin's here from IRRI, Erie, and where is Yvonne was here? Yeah, Yvonne is here from IFA, and Ishmael is joined by his chairman as well, who's just over there. So thank you so much for the support of the co-hosting organizations to make this session happen. It's an important conversation, and I hope we can continue it. Thank you.